transition from death to life began with a crushing, impossible heat. Ruth's vision was a blurred tapestry of white lace and a slate-gray sky, the world fading into a quiet, frozen ending. She lay in the Deadlands, the air so cold it felt as though her lungs were shattering with every shallow breath. The betrayal of Silas, the man she had loved since childhood, stung more than the frostbite claiming her limbs. He had cast her out in thin rags, a sacrificial lamb framed for a crime she didn't commit. Just as her heart slowed to a final crawl, a shadow loomed over her, darker and more imposing than the storm itself. It was King Robert, the Alpha King of the Northern Realms. His presence was a physical weight that seemed to push back the howling blizzard. He did not hesitate, dropping to the permafrost and scooping her broken form into his massive arms, as if she were made of precious glass rather than discarded flesh. As he pulled her against his fur-lined cloak, Ruth felt a protective rage radiating from him, a primal, ancient heat that ignored the sub-zero temperatures. He looked down at her not with the pity Silas had shown, but with the burning intensity of a hunter who had finally found his missing half. As Robert carried her past his silver-clad elite guard and toward the obsidian gates of the White Citadel, the great chill of the realm seemed to flicker. The king didn't just see a dying Omega, he saw his fated true mate. For the first time in her life, Ruth felt a warmth so intense it began to thaw the ice in her soul, and she realized the King of Winter was not her end, but her beginning. Waking was not a gentle drift into consciousness, but a violent return to sensation that felt like needles of fire stitching her back together. Ruth gasped, her eyes snapping open to find herself in a bed of silk so soft it felt like water against her raw, stretched skin. The room was vast and dimly lit by the orange glow of a roaring fireplace, the stone walls adorned with ancient tapestries of wolves locked in eternal combat. As her breath hitched, a figure shifted in a leather armchair by the hearth. It was King Robert. In the firelight, he looked even more lethal than he had in the storm, his dark hair swept back to reveal a sharp jawline and eyes that held the weight of a kingdom. He was watching her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy and thick with his dominance. "Easy," he commanded, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the mattress and into Ruth's very bones. "You are in the White Citadel. You are safe." As he stood and walked toward the bed, the mattress dipped under his immense weight. Instinctively, Ruth flinched, her mind still trapped in Silas's betrayal. Robert paused, a flash of something akin to pain crossing his features before vanishing behind a mask of regal calm. When he finally reached out to check her brow for fever, the contact triggered a primal reaction. A sudden, uncontrollable surge of heat erupted from Ruth's skin, and a bright spark jumped between them, instantly scorching a black hole into the fine silk sheets. Ruth stared at her trembling hands in horror, but Robert didn't pull away. Instead, his eyes burned with a golden light, recognizing the fire that had finally begun to answer his cold. In the quiet of the royal infirmary, the air still smelled of scorched silk and the lingering ozone of Ruth's sudden outburst. Robert remained seated on the edge of the bed, his large hand hovering near hers, refusing to be intimidated by the fire she had accidentally unleashed. He looked at Ruth with a solemnity that silenced her apologies before she could even speak them. "I have spent a decade as a half-souled king," Robert confessed, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to echo the loneliness of the mountain peaks. He explained that his own heart had been freezing along with the realm, a physical manifestation of a life lived without a fated mate. The great chill that plagued the north was not merely weather, it was a reflection of his own internal winter, a slow death that only her presence could arrest. He leaned closer, his golden eyes locking onto hers with a desperate, ancient hope. He made a vow then, one that carried the weight of his crown and his life. He had not rescued her out of a king's pity or a sense of duty. He had saved her because she was the missing piece of the North, the solar flame destined to thaw his kingdom and his soul. Ruth listened in stunned silence, the paralyzing fear of her own voice beginning to crack under the heat of his devotion. Without her fire, he admitted, the North would remain a graveyard of ice, and he would remain a king of shadows. For the first time, Ruth realized she wasn't just a survivor of a betrayal. She was the cure for a dying empire. The fragile peace of the citadel shattered late that evening when a series of muffled explosions echoed from the lower levels. Iron Ridge spies, utilizing their knowledge of Ruth's former pack's tactics, had infiltrated the fortress under the cover of a shifting mist. The internal alarms wailed, a shrill contrast to the previous silence of the royal wing. In the chaos of the breach, a young servant girl was pinned beneath a massive, falling shard of enchanted ice that had been dislodged from the ceiling by a kinetic blast. The girl's screams were cut short as the unnatural cold of the shard began to leach the life from her limbs. Robert was occupied at the heavy oak doors, his claws extended as he fought off a trio of assassins, leaving Ruth alone near the trapped girl. Driven by a primal instinct that overrode her paralyzing fear, Ruth lunged forward. She didn't think. She simply felt the desperate need to protect. As her fingers brushed the enchanted ice, the sun heart within her flared with a sudden blinding brilliance. Her skin glowed with a fierce solar light, and the air around her began to shimmer with intense heat. The ice didn't just break. It melted into steam in a matter of seconds. The assassins froze in shock, and even Robert turned, his golden eyes wide with awe at the display of raw power. Ruth stood over the gasping servant, her hands still smoking, the realization dawning on everyone present that she was no longer a secret or a victim. The weak Omega they had sought to erase had vanished, replaced by a beacon of heat that promised to burn any who threatened her new home. Robert chose the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, to officially crown Ruth as his queen. The ballroom was a vast sea of shimmering velvet and sharp tension as the elite of the northern realms gathered to witness the rise of a woman once left for dead. The air hummed with the weight of the crown, but Ruth stood tall, her silver and sapphire headpiece reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers. The atmosphere turned glacial when Silas arrived, masquerading as a diplomat from the Iron Ridge pack. He navigated the crowd with practiced arrogance, eventually cornering Ruth in a quiet alcove. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper as he spoke lies about her true place being back in the mud of Iron Ridge, attempting to manipulate her into returning to the very pack that had discarded her. But Ruth did not flinch, nor did she allow her voice to fail her this time. With Robert standing at her side like a towering wall of protective granite, she looked through her former betrayer as if he were nothing more than melting slush beneath her feet. The power of the Sunheart simmered just beneath her skin, a quiet promise of fire that made Silas recoil. In that moment, the hierarchy of the North shifted permanently. Silas was a ghost of a bitter past, while Ruth was the radiant future of a kingdom that would never be cold again. To master the heat roaring within her, Ruth traveled with Robert to the ancient volcanic ruins hidden deep beneath the northern permafrost. The air in the subterranean temple was thick with sulfur and the heavy scent of old magic, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the surface world. As she walked through the obsidian halls, the Sunheart gene in her blood pulsed in rhythm with the dormant magma veins of the earth. Deep within the inner sanctum, Ruth discovered the true history of her lineage. The Firebearers had not been hunted for being weak, but because they were the only power capable of melting the High Council's absolute control over the ice. The revelations acted as a final catalyst, stripping away the last of her self-doubt. She emerged from the temple not merely as a mate or a rescued Omega, but as a fully realized weapon of the sun. The war arrived in the dead of night, heralded by a silence so profound it felt like a physical blow. Silas and the rebel coalition had not come for a fair fight. They activated the frostbind artifacts, long-forbidden relics unearthed from the dark corners of the world. These devices emitted a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the stone walls of the citadel, acting as a magical anchor that suppressed the shifting abilities of every wolf within its radius. As the temperature plummeted to impossible, bone-cracking lows, the defenders found themselves trapped in their human skin, their inner wolves howling in a void they could no longer reach. The great obsidian gates, once impenetrable, began to crack under the unnatural pressure of the magical deep freeze. Ruth could feel the desperation of the pack through the bond, a cold fear that threatened to extinguish their will to fight. Outside, the horizon was swallowed by an encroaching army, their armor glinting like ice in the moonlight. They moved with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was declawed. Robert stood at the center of the courtyard, his breath hitching in the sub-zero air, looking up at the balcony where Ruth stood. Even without his wolf, his eyes remained golden, a silent command for her to stay hidden as the first of the enemy ladders hit the walls. The great chill had finally come to claim them all, and for the first time, the king looked truly vulnerable. The enemy breached the main gates with a deafening roar, the heavy wood splintering under the pressure of magical frost and iron rams. Led by Silas in reinforced tactical gear, the rebel coalition poured into the courtyard like a dark tide. Robert, stripped of his wolf form by the artifacts but not of his courage, threw himself into the front lines. He fought with nothing but steel and raw grit, his movements hampered by the supernatural cold that sought to turn his blood to slush. From the high balcony, Ruth watched in agony as Robert took hit after hit. Even as he was battered by silver-tipped blades and heavy blunt force, he continued to shield the path to the inner keep where Ruth was positioned. He was a wall of muscle and sheer willpower, but his strength began to visibly fail as the magical cold leached the warmth from his body. Silas moved through the carnage with predatory ease, his eyes fixed on the fallen king, sensing the moment of final victory was at hand. The defenders were being pushed back, their human forms no match for the enchanted weaponry of the invaders. Robert stumbled to one knee, his breath coming in ragged, frozen plumes as he looked up one last time toward Ruth. The citadel was falling, the silence of the great chill threatening to swallow the last remnants of the northern kingdom. The sight of Silas raising a jagged blade over the fallen human form of Robert finally shattered the last seal on Ruth's power. She let out a scream that shook the very foundations of the mountain, a sound that carried the weight of her ancestors' stolen fire. Her sun heart did not just glow, it erupted. Ruth leaped from the high balcony, but she did not fall. She descended on a wave of pure thermal energy, her eyes glowing with the brilliance of 1,000 midday suns. As her feet hit the frozen stones of the courtyard, she unleashed a golden shockwave that incinerated the frostbind artifacts instantly. The unnatural, magical cold was vaporized, turning the white courtyard into a chaotic sea of steam and blinding light. In that instant, the suppression was lifted. Across the battlefield, the northern wolves felt their inner beasts roar back to life, shifting mid-air to tear into the stunned rebels. Ruth stood at the center of the vortex, a goddess of the sun reborn in the heart of winter. Silas was thrown back by the sheer force of her heat, his armor glowing red as he cowered before the woman he had once left to die. The Great Chill had been met with a solar fury it could not contain. The rebel coalition was scattered into the night, their remnants fleeing the radiant heat that now bathed the white citadel. The Iron Ridge Pack, stripped of its treacherous leadership, was officially absorbed into a new, united northern domain. On the battlefield, the once frozen courtyard began to bloom with rare flowers, awakened by the solar residue of Ruth's power. As the morning sun crested the mountain peaks, Ruth and Robert stood together on the high balcony, overlooking a kingdom that was finally at peace. They stood as the first true pair the North had seen in centuries, their bond solidified through fire and blood. Ruth looked out at the horizon, her silver and sapphire crown glinting in the light, feeling the steady, warm pulse of the sun heart within her chest. Robert pulled her close, his golden eyes reflecting the dawn of a new era. For the first time in 10 years, the air carried a genuine physical heat that reached the very marrow of his bones. The eternal winter had been broken, replaced by a golden age where no one, neither the lowest Omega nor the Alpha King, would ever have to be cold again. Ruth leaned her head against Robert's shoulder, finally silent, not out of fear, but out of a profound and lasting peace.